Nintendo is a lot of things to a lot of people. The company's been through many ups and downs in its 139-year history. Yes, you heard that right. This video game company has been around for more than a century. But believe it or not, they were not always a video game company. Since 1889, Nintendo has gone from making flower and nature-themed playing cards, rice, no, we are not kidding, candy machines, and a love tester of all things, to making video games and consoles. The Nintendo that most of us know really only developed into its final form in the 1980s, with the introduction of the Nintendo Entertainment System, or Famicom, family computer, in Japan. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, not a day went by on the playground that children from all kinds of backgrounds would discuss the latest tips of beating those notoriously Nintendo hard titles like Battletoads, Mario, and The Legend of Zelda. Not only were Nintendo's products among the hottest toys on the market for pretty much any holiday season in the late 80s and 90s, but they single-handedly revived a dead industry while also revolutionizing what a video game could be. Here is the story of how Nintendo went from making simple playing cards to saving the video game industry. Welcome to About Us, the channel where we talk about the history of companies, from epic rises of captains of industry and historic falls to phoenix-like revivals. I'm your host and script author for this episode, Eric Malachite. Because yeah, I'm a massive fan of Nintendo. They were a huge part of growing up for me, and I think you're going to love where this story goes. Pun intended. So strap in, tell us what your favorite Nintendo games were growing up, deploy your likes and subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell for more videos just like this. Let's get started. According to the documentary Playing with Power, The Nintendo Story, and several other sources, Nintendo got its start making playing cards in 1889, known as Hanafuda, which translates roughly to flower cards. But what a lot of those other sources don't tell you is that the traditional playing cards you might use to play blackjack were actually not legal to sell in Japan in the late 1880s. Playing cards, however, had been in circulation thanks to Portuguese traders as early as the 16th century. Those playing cards were super popular, but the Japanese government eventually banned both foreigners and the cards they were selling. But the popularity of those cards persisted, and the government eventually relented, allowing cards once again, with one catch. Playing card sets could not feature numbers on them. Fusajiro Yamauchi saw an opportunity to skirt the gambling prohibition laws of the time by founding Nintendo Koppai as a playing card company. Instead of featuring numbers on them, these cards featured beautiful artwork of flowers and other nature scenes. It's probably also important to note that Fusajiro Yamauchi was not the founder's original name. He was originally born Fusajiro Fukui, hence why the cards before World War II often featured a Marufuku marking on them. Fusajiro Fukui originally worked at a construction company and was adopted by the owner, as he had no son of his own at the time, thereby inheriting the Yamauchi name before he set off to create the company that would become Nintendo. At a glance, these artful Hanafuda cards don't look like they would be easy to use in a game of blackjack or faro, but it didn't take long for the Yakuza to find ways to incorporate them into their games, most commonly by assigning point values to the different images that appear on the cards. While Hanafuda cards do not use suits or numbers, they do feature artwork of the seasons and the illustrations of various types of flowers. Speaking of Yakuza, gambling, and cards, many people believe that Nintendo itself means leave luck to heaven, but there is no true consensus on the meaning of the name. And it seems that the man who came up with the name Fusajiro Yamauchi took the secret to his grave in 1940. And folks, these Hanafuda cards were a massive hit. In fact, if you travel to Japan, you can still buy Nintendo Hanafuda cards at many of the variety shops you'll find in the country. Nintendo remained a playing card company leading into the 1900s and onward into the pre-World War II era, keeping its original headquarters in Kyoto, Japan until 1930. But during the 1900s, Nintendo would be the first company in Japan to successfully and legally bring Western-style playing cards to the Japanese market. It was 1907, and Yamauchi's old distribution system wasn't quite cutting the mustard, so he made a deal to sell the cards in cigarette shops owned by the Japan Tobacco and Salt Public Corporation, Throughout the pre-World War II era, Nintendo absolutely dominated the playing card industry, often being cited as the largest company in the game. But by 1929, Fusajiro Yamauchi was ready to retire. But who would he pass the torch to lead Nintendo forward? The answer, of course, is Sakuro Yamauchi, who married into the family in 1907 when he was arranged to wed Tei Yamauchi, Fusajiro's daughter. Now, with its old CEO retiring, Sakuro stepped up to the plate to guide the company forward. By 1933, the company moved headquarters to a new building, right next door to the old one. Sakuro would also establish a new distribution partnership with a company called Marufuku Company Limited to distribute the company's Western-style cards. But ultimately, in 1949, he would be forced to step down and pass the torch to Hiroshi Yamauchi after suffering a stroke that left him bedridden. Hiroshi agreed to leave school and become the new president of Nintendo on one condition. Fearing that the employees would never respect him the way they had Sakuro, Hiroshi demanded he be allowed to fire anyone who was resistant to change. Yeah, that sucks, and although Sakuro was reluctant to agree, he did, and Hiroshi came in swinging his massive corporate left and right, firing first his cousin, then an entire factory of workers who went on strike, and then pretty much anyone that so much as looked at him funny. Actually, I kind of embellished that last part, but the point is, it was a bloodbath. Hiroshi did not want anyone stuck in the old ways to hold the company back from his grand vision. But what was that vision exactly? For starters, he changed the name of the distribution company Marufuku Company Limited to Nintendo Karuta Company Limited in Japan and Nintendo Playing Card Company Limited everywhere else, and a year later began modernizing the company by moving the headquarters to yet another new building, streamlining the production process of the company's cards by consolidating production plants in Kyoto and bringing the company's cards into the modern age by introducing plastic-coated cards. Hiroshi also partnered with Disney. Yeah, allowing the company to produce playing cards with Mickey Mouse and many of its other characters at the time. And in 1962, Nintendo listed its stock for the first time as a publicly traded company. And then things got a little weird in 1963. When Hiroshi made yet another change to the company. His plan was to expand the business into many more areas, and so the change to Nintendo Company Limited was necessary. But if you think we're ready to dive into how the company saved the video game industry, think again, because the pieces for that story wouldn't start moving until more than a decade later. No, 1963 ushered in a different kind of era. If you ever thought that Nintendo, a company associated with children's entertainment, mushroom kingdoms, and flying magical princesses, with the seedy business of operating love hotels, then congrats, you know it all, here's your cookie. But for everyone else, it's probably a massive shock to realize that the company that defined their childhood once operated a hotel whose sole purpose was to offer a place to form the beast with two backs, going so far as to offer hourly rates. The point is, this era saw Nintendo branching out into many varied ventures, ones that the official Nintendo website kindly just skips over on its company history page. We're not going to cover all of them, because we'd be here all freaking day. And you probably came to this video wanting to hear about video games, right? But the company tried all sorts of things during this era. We're talking Nintendo Instant Rice, freaking Nintendo Taxis of all things, and the previously mentioned Love Hotel, which, interestingly enough, apparently Hiroshi was a loyal and frequent customer of, despite being, married. Of these three ventures, only the taxi company was successful, but Hiroshi found negotiating with the extremely powerful taxi driver unions to be exhausting and probably extremely annoying. So he closed all of that crap down and focused on Nintendo's biggest winning product, playing cards. Yeah, all of that to come back to square one, right? But the 1970s would see Nintendo pivot away from playing cards once again in the wake of low sales, and finally, start taking strides to becoming the Nintendo that we all know, love, and occasionally hate. The 1970s saw Nintendo play around with breaking into making electronic toys, like this laser clay shooting system that bears a striking resemblance to Duck Hunt. Interestingly enough, this game ended up rivaling bowling as one of Japan's major pastimes. Nintendo would also produce light guns for the US video game market for the Magnavox Odyssey, probably the first time the company would dip its toes into the video game industry. They partnered with Mitsubishi Electric on a video recording system, incorporated a microprocessor into a video game system, and created Color TV Games 6 and 15, two game systems that allowed kids to play a knockoff of Breakout on their home television sets. In 1979, Minoru Arakawa, the son-in-law of Hiroshi Yamauchi, opened Nintendo of America in New York City, and would introduce Game & Watch products that basically look like miniature Game Boys, but feature extremely rudimentary graphics and gameplay. These were workshopped by future Game Boy and Metroid creator Gunpei Yokoi. But by far, the biggest step Nintendo would take toward becoming the company we know today is when they brought Donkey Kong to market in 1981. But before we can talk about Donkey Kong and his creator, engineer Shigeru Miyamoto, we've got to talk about Radar Scope and Nintendo's foray into the arcade scene in both Japan and America. In the late 1970s, Nintendo of America dabbled in creating coin-operated video game cabinets for arcades and all kinds of other businesses. Mostly though, these were clones of popular shooters like Galaga and Space Invaders. Their most popular cabinet, however, was called Radar Scope, which was essentially another clone of Space Invaders. But the game was a hit in Japanese arcades, so Nintendo arranged for 3,000 of these things to be made and shipped off to the American market, and no one wanted it. Business owners already had a litany of shooters, so another one seemed superfluous. And to add insult to injury, players were annoyed by the sound effects produced by the cabinet. While Arakawa and company were able to offload 1,000 copies of the game to various businesses with some good old-fashioned salesmanship, they were basically stuck with the rest of that stock. The game cabinets were just sitting in a warehouse in Hackensack, New Jersey, and after moving the company's headquarters to Seattle, Washington to be closer to Japan, Arakawa came up with a solution. He needed to find a use for those 2,000 cabinets. So Arakawa asked Nintendo of Japan to create a new game to slot right into those cabinets. But all the designers at home base were busy working on other projects. Shigeru Miyamoto was working as a staff engineer, painting cabinets and whatnot, and was tasked with making a new game. Initially, he was just asked to come up with some new features and remake Radar Scope, but instead, he decided to make something else entirely. At the time, Nintendo was working on a similar license deal to their thing with Disney back in the day with the playing cards, but with Popeye. So the plan was to create a Popeye game, but ultimately that did not work out. But there was something about the love triangle in Popeye that inspired Miyamoto. Miyamoto also loved manga, Japanese comics for those who don't know, and grew up watching old science fiction movies and westerns. The man is, simply put, an incredibly creative person with a unique imagination. But at the time he was working for Nintendo, he wasn't quite sure what he wanted to do with that imagination. Working on Donkey Kong would ultimately launch his career as a game designer, because the game itself was a massive frickin' hit. But despite Donkey Kong becoming the hottest selling arcade machine in the business in 1981, the video game industry was in for some tough times. Before Nintendo brought the NES to market and saved the video game industry in 1985, the industry over here in the US was dominated by the likes of Pong in 1972, Atari in 1977, Intellivision, and later in 1982, ColecoVision, which would end up with a port of Nintendo's Donkey Kong, something that would sour a distribution deal for the Famicom with Atari. Some games, like the infamous E.T. the Extraterrestrial, would become actual garbage when thousands of Atari games were buried in a New Mexico landfill, led to the whole industry coming apart at the seams. We won't go through all the details. Let us know if you'd like a video on the video game crash of 1983, as there is an absolute landfill worth of information on that subject. Again, pun intended. But all you really need to know is that no one wanted to hear the word video game, much less stock one on store shelves. So you can probably imagine that Nintendo was facing an uphill battle, to say the least, when it wanted to localize its immensely popular family computer here in the States.
The Nintendo Entertainment System. Now you're playing with power.
While the American markets were dealing with the collapse of the video game industry, Nintendo was still going strong in Japan, coming out with a twin-screen interactive Versus system for arcade machines. But finally, on July 15, 1983, Nintendo released the system that would not only save the video game industry, but revolutionize it as well: the Famicom, or Family Computer. The Famicom was a cartridge-based 8-bit system, and while Sega and several other companies would also bring 8-bit systems to market, none of them could match the Famicom in terms of sales. It was an absolute force of nature in that regard, with 2.5 million units and 15 million cartridges being sold by the end of 1984. Naturally, Nintendo wanted to replicate this success in North America, but with the industry still feeling the effects of the crash of '83, retailers wanted nothing to do with the new system. Toys R Us, may you rest in peace, said no to stocking this system until their head honcho decided otherwise. So the company came up with a brilliant new marketing approach. They didn't use the word video game at all, calling their new product the Nintendo Entertainment System, and it differed heavily from the Famicom it was originally based on. For starters, where the Famicom was a small red and white rectangular unit with two built-in controllers that could be holstered on either side of the unit, as well as a top-loading port for plugging in cartridges like the Super Nintendo in the US, instead the Nintendo Entertainment System, or simply NES, used a front-loading port like a VCR and featured a gray and black design with stylish red lettering on the front. Its controllers and other add-on devices like the infamous Power Glove were also fully detachable. It was basically a complete overhaul in terms of branding for the company. Instead of a video game system with cartridges, Nintendo described its product as a control deck that you inserted game packs into. What's the difference between a cartridge and a game pack? Trick question, there is none. Now you're playing with marketing power. But Nintendo wasn't done. To make things more enticing for retailers who, by the way, lost millions of dollars on Atari, they guaranteed the sale of the NES and the games that came with it, which if you don't know anything about business, that's a massive gamble. They also packed in a little robot called Rob into the NES's packaging that basically acted as a rudimentary second player. Nintendo essentially took the tactic of marketing their gaming system as a toy, rather than a typical piece of electronics. Just look at the difference between Nintendo's advertisements versus Atari and ColecoVision's back in the day, and you'll see a night and day difference.
Now you can bring the arcade experience home. Introducing ColecoVision, the most advanced video game system you can buy. It plays more games than any other system. Arcade games with multiple screens like Donkey Kong. Arcade games like Zaxxon with its three-dimensional look. Adventure with 15 different screens. Cosmic Avenger. And ColecoVision's new Smurf game. Coming soon. ColecoVision's first expansion module that lets you play all the Atari VCS compatible cartridges. Now you can bring the arcade experience home because your vision is our vision. ColecoVision.
Will you be the one to witness the birth of the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System? The one to play with Rob, the extraordinary video robot, batteries not included. He helps you tackle even the toughest challenge. Will you be the first to raise the incredibly accurate Zapper and play games like Duck Hunt or action-packed Hogan's Alley and high-flying Kung Fu, each sold separately? Will you be the one to experience the Nintendo Entertainment System? Comes with Rob, Zapper, Control Deck, 2 controllers, Gyromite, and Duck Hunt.
All of these clever marketing gimmicks reassured parents that they weren't buying one of those crappy Ataris. But perhaps one of the more controversial decisions Nintendo made also helped to instill more confidence in their products. In order to avoid the mistakes made by other publishers, which led to the crash of '83, Nintendo created the 10 NES lockout hardware that prevented the NES from playing unlicensed games. Game packs had this security chip on the circuit board that communicated with the 10 NES hardware, allowing games to be played on the system. While Tengen, a subsidiary of Atari, would eventually reverse engineer this chip and produce a litany of unlicensed games before attracting Nintendo's ire, the 10 NES lockout hardware ensured that third-party developers had to agree to Nintendo's strict terms before they could get access to the chip and Nintendo's coveted seal of quality. The NES was a massive hit in North America, single-handedly saving the video game industry from the effects of the video game crash of 1983, managing to sell 61 million units of both the Famicom and the NES by the end of 1985, with over 30 million game packs sold in the US. A large portion of the credit for that success should go to Shigeru Miyamoto, who created Super Mario Bros., one of the most popular and best-selling games of all time. As of 2024, This system has managed to sell 61.91 million units worldwide. But while the NES successfully established Nintendo as the #1 top dog of the video game industry in the 1980s, rivalries would brew, leading to a bitter console war that would see the rise of clever marketing strategies, a certain snarky blue hedgehog, and the rise of more competitors. But that's a story for another time. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to drop a like, comment your favorite Nintendo franchise, suggest new topics for us to cover, subscribe to the channel if you're not, and share this video with someone who loves learning about the history of companies and the fascinating stories and people that made them household names. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.